welcome, folks. Other folks will come in as in the next little while. I'm Bob Miller. I'm president of Marin Conservation League. I'm also chair of Marin Conservation League's Climate Action Working Group. Marin Conservation League's mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance the natural assets of Marin in a changing environment. And of course, a big part of changing environment is a rapidly changing climate. So we develop and advocate for policies on many Marin-related environmental issues. So if you're not a member, please join. Some folks here are not, so please do. Marin Conservation League's other committees address climate change adaptation. In this committee, we focus on greenhouse gas emissions reductions primarily, not exclusively. And obviously, vehicle and building electrification is a key part of reducing greenhouse gases. We have Zach Franklin here today from Grid Alternatives, in part because a group of us believe that Marin needs an EV acceleration plan soon, one that's aggressive, comprehensive, multi-stakeholder, innovative, and equitable. And then stakeholders can use that plan to seek grant funding to scale innovative initiatives, initiatives that could be spread elsewhere. And the needs of underserved communities has to be a core component of any plan. So that brings us to our speaker. But before we do that, we will go to the agenda. All right, so let me see if I can share screen. Okay, so here we go. You should be looking at an agenda right now. Yes?
It's not up.
It's
What?
trying. You're trying. It's
Okay.
spinning.
I'll tell you what, why don't I stop sharing and I'll just, there are not very many agenda items here. I am having a lot of difficulty right now, so.
You can just put it in the chat.
Okay.
Copy it and put it in the chat.
So what we're going to do is to have a Q&A with Zach Franklin from Grid Alternatives. And then what we're going to do is have a discussion on a building electrification ordinance letter and on the a potential letter to the California Air Resources Board. And have additional reports from organizations in the time that remains. So if that's okay with folks, and folks don't have any additional items to add, I don't see anybody raising their hands. Let's get to Zach. And Zach, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about what Grid Alternatives is doing, and just take it away.
Sure thing. Yeah. Thanks, Bob. Thanks to everybody. It's appreciate you inviting me into your group this morning. My name is Zach Franklin. Use he, him pronouns. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at a national nonprofit called Grid Alternatives. That was, I'm personally based here in the Bay Area. Organization was started here, but we now do work across the country and a little bit beyond the country's borders as well. But we deploy community driven solutions for economic and environmental justice. Historically have focused on solar power and have now expanded into other technologies, electric vehicles and other clean mobility solutions, battery storage, but all with the same premise that the communities that could benefit the most from these great new technologies economically, and in many ways in the context of quality of life, but have also borne the brunt of the old way of powering our society, have the least access to them in the marketplace. And so we exist to make sure that there are other strategies and programs and implement those strategies and programs to make sure that it's not just up to the market, that everybody has the opportunity to take advantage of these great new technologies, and in the process make sure that we can decarbonize our whole society, and not just the folks who can afford to pay for cool new climate tech. So little bit about our organization. I sit at kind of our, in business terms, the corporate headquarters, the part of our organization that does work across all of our geographies. We also have a network of local affiliates, including one that serves the Bay Area that's based in Oakland. We have one in Los Angeles, one in San Diego, one in the Inland Empire, one in the Central Valley, one in sort of Sacramento in the North Valley, one in Colorado, one in Washington, D.C. that serves the Mid-Atlantic region. We have a pretty big tribal program that works with 50 or so Native American tribes, mostly west of the Mississippi, and then a small international program that works in Nicaragua, Nepal, and more recently the sort of the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border. But it's all with the same focus, all with the same mission. And in terms of my particular role, the last 5.5 years I've been in my current role working on strategy and new initiatives, and sort of identified the sort of transportation electrification as a particularly big area where there was a great need for implementation of equity programs to make sure that everybody can transition to clean transportation. So we run a variety of programs that I'm happy to speak more about, both locally here in the Bay Area, and throughout the state, now increasingly in other states as well. Unfortunately, California right now is too much of a leader when it comes to the intersection of climate solutions and equity. We want the rest of the country to kind of be able to do more of this work as well. But it's an exciting laboratory to be able to really figure out how to do clean transportation equity right. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm based in South Berkeley right now, lived in the Bay Area for 22 years, originally from Southern California. Got 2 kids, 17 and 14, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Great. Okay, so what tends to happen is, for me, is that all is good until I get to these meetings, and then my technology stops working. So for the first question we really have for you is, what are the challenges? You implement a whole bunch of different programs. And you could go into lots of detail about each one of them, but what we really want to know is, what are the challenges that you're running into in dealing with the types of programs that you're dealing with? And what are the potential solutions that you think might scale?
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I'm guessing that with this audience, there's a decent amount of at least baseline understanding of things like electric vehicles and what have you. But obviously, please jump in, either raise your hand, put questions in the chat box or what have you, with clarifying questions or anything like that. Seems like a small enough group we can be informal about it. But yeah, I mean, the thing with transportation electrification, in any community, but particularly in the communities that we serve, is that there's a lot of pieces you have to have in place. There's no one silver bullet, right? And obviously we're all humans. There's part of us that looking for some silver bullet. There's one policy, one strategy, one thing we can do. If you do that, kind of it unlocks everything. But particularly for transportation electrification in the communities that we serve, there's really a set of interlocking challenges that you have to address, right? And particularly in the context of renters. So what we've learned, and what I'm guessing many of you all are privileged enough to be able to experience, is that the transition from electric vehicles is not necessarily about the transition from going to the Chevron station to going to a fast charger that looks like the Chevron station. It's primarily charging at home, which is wonderful. It's the cheapest place to charge. It's the most convenient place to charge. You come home from work, you plug in your car, and you wake up in the morning with a full tank of gas every day. That's $1 a gallon, right? What's not to love, right? And you can power it by clean energy. It's just a fundamentally better experience. And for those of us who are lucky to be, homeowners, have garages that we control, things like that, it's a relatively straightforward, way to pull that off. But the majority of the folks that we serve rent. And that's where things get complicated, right? And you have multiple entities with different incentives, the tenant and the property owner. In some cases, you're talking about larger apartment buildings where just the physical plant has a lot of challenges of putting in charging. But fundamentally, you also just have a series of split incentives. Often we sort of talk about it in the context of the chicken and egg, right? And I don't know which one is the chicken and which one is the egg, but on the landlord side, say, well, it sounds very costly and complicated to put in charging, and I don't know if I have the money and the time. And by the way, my tenants don't even have these cars. So why should I spend a bunch of time and energy putting in charging in the parking lot? Mm. And then the tenants will say, well, it sounds really expensive. I don't have the money for it. I don't, people I know don't have these cars in terms of my community, and I don't have a place to charge it when I come home, right? There's no charging here, right? And so both sides are kind of like, in a situation where they're dependent on the other for who's going to move first. And so given the fact that, the majority of the folks in the communities that we serve rent, this is a huge challenge that we wrestle with. And so the solution, which, we are now working on, and I noticed that there's somebody from our partners at Marin Clean Energy who we're actually collaborating on the solution with, is to the chicken and the egg issue is you bring the whole farm, right? The question of which came first, anyone who's like stops and thinks about chickens and eggs knows that the question is a fallacy. They came at the same time, right? It's all part of a single system, right? But instead of looking for a silver bullet and saying, oh, well, if we just have this one rebate or this one incentive or this one policy, everything else will fall into place. That's just not how it works, particularly in the communities that we serve. What works are comprehensive, thoughtful solutions that work with the community, identify all the barriers and the needs, and bring it all together. And that's exactly what we're doing. And so if the timing of this is interesting, I don't think that, Bob and the crew knew that this was happening when they reached out, but we've actually just recently gotten a couple of major grant awards in partnership with both Marin Clean Energy and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District to do a whole bunch of multifamily EV projects using this exact model. So bringing in charging infrastructure, working with the community to identify what that looks like, how to set that up in the parking lot in a way that works for everybody, right? There's a lot of technical challenges in terms of you're adding a bunch of electrical load to, in some cases, an older building. How do you deal with that? If you're only putting in charging for some parking places, that might be someone's parking space, right, that you want to put it into. And maybe people who are in that parking space right now, they don't drive an EV, and there's going to be tension there. So there's social challenges, there are technical challenges, the question of then how do you pay for it? Is this going to be something that's provided as an amenity to tenants? Is this something where they're going to have to pay for it? How does the money work, right? And so one of the things that we're doing with the Marin projects is incorporating solar, right? My preference about who's going to pay for it is the sun. that's just my 2 cents. It seems like, you know, if you have the ability, particularly when you get, grant funding, some of this funding is coming from the California Energy Commission, other funding coming from other sources. But when you have grant funding, that covers one-time costs. And so incorporating solar is a great way of basically buying down long-term operating costs with a capital funding source. And then really doing deep tenant engagement, community outreach, not just in general, but also in terms of helping tenants access all the incentives that are available to get a car, right? So then we can go in and say, hey, you want to know why we're tearing up your parking lot and putting in funny looking electrical outlets? Well, turns out Gavin Newsom wants you to buy a new kind of car. And look, here's a whole bunch of programs that exist out there to buy down the cost and help you, go through it. And people who speak your language, both literally and figuratively, who can help you walk through the process. The Grid Bay Area affiliate that I mentioned administers the Clean Cars for All scrap and replace program for the local air district, which, is focusing on the more highly polluted areas. So, more for folks in Richmond than in Marin, but there's a variety of programs out there. So really comprehensive solutions that address the chicken, the egg, the obvious problems, and the not so obvious problems. And so, happy to talk about that in more detail, but we're really excited. And what was the cool thing about working with Marin Clean Energy is, in addition to working with them to get funding from the Energy Commission to focus on some of the more kind of top priority areas like Richmond and West Oakland, they were able to work with the Marin Community Foundation as well to get some additional funding so that we can do some of this work in Marin as well. Because we know just because there are a lot of high priority communities in Richmond doesn't mean there isn't also, need in your all's backyard in addition to that. So happy to share more information about it. The timing is just, all this stuff just happened. So the timing is very, apt to have this conversation. But that's the short answer, is that, the way that you address these, challenges is through, comprehensive, thoughtful solutions. And then the last thing I'll say is that why we think multifamily charging is so important is because everybody wants to charge at home. Going back to what I said at the beginning, it's the cheapest, most convenient way to charge. And what we don't want is a future of super low cost, convenient charging for the well-to-do, and more expensive, less convenient charging for the people who have the least both time and money to accommodate that. We want good stuff for everybody.
So Zach, maybe you could provide some context. What are some other similar kinds of programs that you know about elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, certainly California is way ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the country, as I mentioned. And so, to the extent we're also interested in things that may be relevant to your community, there's another program that, it's got some challenges, but is also got some positive aspects of it in California that's run by the California Air Resources Board, that provides funding for shared clean mobility equity projects. So sort of more neighborhood or community scale projects, less about, an electric vehicle and a charger for Ms. Smith and Mr. Rodriguez, and more about a shared fleet of EVs, e-bikes, those sort of things for an entire affordable housing complex or for a neighborhood or what have you, that's shared by the community. It is, like many of the state's programs, focused primarily on the communities geographically that have, borne the brunt of pollution historically. So, many of the geographies in Marin County would not be eligible, but my understanding of some of the changes that are being proposed for that program for the next round of funding is that there will be somewhat more flexibility in terms of what I'm guessing is some highly concentrated pockets of poverty within Marin County that may not have historic pollution burdens, but certainly have historic economic burdens. So in that context, there may be some opportunities. Historically, those have been grants of up to $1 million, and what we've heard more recently is that the next round of funding could be as much as $2.5 million. So those are really interesting in the context of what I said before, which is that not only would they be shared mobility solutions, which is sort of an interesting, but the underlying funding allows for infrastructure funding, vehicle funding, outreach funding, is more comprehensive solutions as opposed to a funding source that just tries to push at one particular pain point and assume the community will figure out the rest. So it's called Clean Mobility Options, and happy to share more about that if that's of interest in the context of the next round of funding potentially having some overlap geographically with certain parts of Marin County.
So in submitting your proposals, you'll have come up with some estimates of costs. And could you talk a little bit about what kind of dollar numbers we're dealing with here when you're dealing with a multifamily unit dwelling, and that becomes important because if you want to scale something and make it really big, the smaller the cost, the easier the scaling.
Yeah, I mean, the frank reality around that is that the cost range is incredibly variable, particularly on the multifamily side of things, and particularly when you're talking about retrofits, right? So one thing, and as you all think about policies for going forward, is that what we've heard from the multifamily housing owners that we work with in the affordable housing space in particular is, when do they want to do this? It's during new construction of new affordable housing, or secondarily, if they can't do that during like a massive rehabilitation, you know, ideally, like, because so much of the cost is like not just the charging stuff, it's tearing up the parking lot, it's dealing with the back end infrastructure. And then it also, the new construction timeframe deals with some of the sociological issues of the, you know, what I would call the politics of the parking lot. If you haven't yet programmed who's got what parking space because it's a new building, that is an ideal time to put in this infrastructure. And it's also lower cost, right? Building a parking lot and then a couple years later tearing it up, trenching it to put in conduit and adding electrical capacity is just a lot more expensive, right? The actual chargers are not that expensive. That cost is pretty low. It's everything else where the dollar amounts can be off the charts. And so, you know, to the extent that Marin is trying to, you know, kind of catch up and build more affordable housing, you know, and there are funding sources at the county level and the city level that's helping support those costs. You know, I think some sort of carrot and stick approach of, you know, I know that there's a lot of folks out there who are starting to create ordinances that, you know, require new housing to have charging, but in the context of affordable housing, that can be paired with, at least for low income housing, providing funding to offset the additive costs during new construction. That has the benefit of being when it works the best for the housing community and being the most cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
But charging at home, like putting in a home charger, is just like order of magnitude cheaper. That's one of the many reasons why it's such an easier solution for people who have their own home, right? And some of you probably have this experience in your own life. For some people, they don't even put in a charger. They can actually get the charging they need with a rinky-dink 110 electrical outlet and the plug that comes with a car, right? You know, and again, apologize if I'm just saying things that everyone's heard a million times, but, you know, the average, you know, American driver drives 30 to 40 miles a day. You can get that much charge overnight with no special charging equipment at all, as long as you have a place to plug in into a standard 110 electrical outlet, right? And, you know, you've probably seen your communities, people using extension cords, maybe in ways that aren't the most recommended, but it speaks to the fact that, you know, 110 can do a lot. So, but yeah, once you get into multifamily, multi-units, you know, the affordable, you know, the sort of the physical plant of an apartment complex, the costs do get a lot higher. But it's worth it because that's going to get people the lowest cost, most convenient charging that everybody wants. I'm looking at something in the chat box. Orange, yes, Orange is one of the technology providers that's doing clearly some folks here are very knowledgeable about this sort of notion of what some people might refer to as smart level 1 charging. So, going back to what I was saying about, the unsung hero, the boring old 110 electrical outlet, I think there's some particularly good applications of that in multifamily housing. One of the benefits you have when you do home charging is that you can trickle out the power over time, right? The electric grid is not designed to be a gas station, right? It is extremely challenging for all these charging companies and the utilities behind them to put all these fast chargers in and pump a ton of electricity through a single point in the grid in a short period of time. That's not how the grid is designed. It is much easier for our electric grid to trickle out power over time. And given the fact that cars in the United States are parked 95% of the time, it ain't that hard to do. And so Orange is a company, there's other companies who are doing this that are basically saying, how do you take level 1 charging, AKA charging on standard 110 volt power, and do it in a smart way so that a lot of folks can share that connection, so that you can potentially bill customers for the energy they're using. So you can have some of the sort of, the smarts of it, but still keep the power level low. And one of the reasons that's also really important, particularly when we're looking to do retrofits of existing apartment complexes, is that the electrical capacity of the main service at those apartment complexes can be limited, right? And if you want to put in a ton of high power chargers in an apartment complex, not only might that require upgrades to the grid, it might also require really expensive upgrades to the electric service and electric panel for the apartment complex, money that people probably don't have, right? And in some cases, some of these grant programs will pay for those costs, but they can be very costly. And so, yeah, Orange and products like that, sort of smart level 1 solutions, I think are great. As an aside on that, I'll put in a little plug, similar, no pun intended. Oh, geez. Obviously we work with Marin Clean Energy and some of the other community choice aggregators in California. Peninsula Clean Energy down in Silicon Valley has done some really great work around charging multifamily, particularly some of this level 1 stuff. So if people are interested, they put a lot of resources on their website around this. And so I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat box in case people are interested in reading more later. Yeah, for folks who want to kind of do a deeper dive and find folks who've really been doing some cool pilot projects, not too far from Marin, and models that they're clearly saying, hey, copy our stuff, please. We put it up on the web. See another question in the chat box. How does Grid Alternatives go about finding and partnering with a landlord of an existing multifamily dwelling? And I also see there's a hand raised, so we'll get to that next. Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of different ways, depending on the project. And this project that I mentioned before, it's great because we have 3 key partners, all of whom have existing relationships with different housing owners. So there's Grid Alternatives. We do a lot of solar with multifamily affordable housing. We work with a lot of intermediary groups in the affordable housing space. Marin Clean Energy's got some good relationships there. So does the Air District. And so, it's usually relationship based. And some cases we're already working on a solar electric project with an affordable housing developer. And that's an ideal time when you can go in and say, hey, would you be interested in layering and charging as well? And particularly in some cases, the solar project ends up becoming a solar carport. So you're already in the parking lot, then it's a really natural combination. But it's pretty relationship based. I think part of the challenge is that, and I used to work in the affordable housing sector way back in the day before I came into this work, is that, it's really challenging doing that work, just keeping the lights on, right? So you can find somebody, but that's different from them having the time and capacity and bandwidth to work with you on this, to even have that conversation. And generally, particularly in the affordable housing space, they're all values aligned people that want to do it, but that doesn't make the time magically appear in their day. And they're dealing with tenants who have challenges and an exploding toilet in unit 203, and somebody didn't pay their rent and has got an excuse for it, and their own day-to-day lives with COVID and what have you. So half of the challenge is not finding the folks, but is how do you have that conversation in a way that works for the day-to-day practical lived realities of the folks who are in charge of that apartment complex. And so I think that's where it really becomes imperative to meet people where they're at and have resources for more comprehensive solutions that doesn't depend on the property owner filling in some gaps on their own. I see a hand from Jana.
Yes, hi, this is Jana Kopichuk-Lande. I'm with MCE, actually. I'm work for MCE's policy team. So I am not a TE expert per se, but I've been a little bit involved, and I have one comment to make quickly, and then I have one question for you, if I may. The one comment is just tying up on what you had said about Peninsula Clean Energy and kind of certain programs and pilots that help kind of manage that EV charging load. I just wanted to note that MCE has a program like that. It's called MCE Sync. It's a relatively new program, so maybe not too many people know about it yet. It started last year, and we're ramping it up this year. We started last year with a pilot of 200 vehicles, where we're doing something similar like Peninsula Clean Energy, where people sign up to this app, and then the app kind of manages their charging of their vehicles to make sure that the grid doesn't get overburdened, and that when there's time of high grid needs, like usually in the afternoons from 4 to 9 p.m., charging can be reduced if it's not urgent. So if people in Marin are interested, you can check it out on our website. The program is called MCE Sync. And again, we're going from I think 200 vehicles last year as a small pilot to, I think, don't quote me on the number, but several thousand this year. So that was my one comment. And then my question for you was, again, because I'm not a transportation electrification specialist, I'm thinking of Marin. I am a proud resident of Marin County. And in my neighborhood, I totally agree that multifamily is like the first thing we need to tackle. But if we want to switch a little bit gears and think about like low income or low middle income single family homeowners, where I think there's quite a few in Marin, what I've heard kind of in my circle of friends is that I may be able to afford the car, but I can't afford the electrical panel upgrades that are required, because Marin has such an old housing stock. A lot of us live in houses between 1920 and 1940, especially in the southern Marin area. So how big of an issue are electrical panel upgrades for like the lower middle income folks? How big of a burden do you think that is?
Yeah. That's a great one. It's a significant burden, and it's sort of an interesting intersection of significant but kind of under discussed, because it's sort of not the shiny object, right? Solar panels, electric cars, that's what everybody wants to talk about. That boring box, that gray box on the side of your house, not quite so sexy. But to your point, that's the gateway to all the cool stuff. And if the gateway is broken, you can't get in. And so, yes, we do see this. We've seen this with our solar program for a long time, where a lot of people can't get a residential solar electric system on their house without an electrical upgrade. And historically, there have not been dedicated funding sources to support that piece. But what's cool about that, particularly going back to lovely people in Marin, is that that's something that, local jurisdictions can have an impact on. Richmond, for example, when we work in Richmond, they've put up some municipal money so that if folks, they're really trying to help their income qualified folks get things like solar and EVs, this often comes up as a barrier. So Richmond actually has put up some money so that when we do that, right, we have a bucket of money to go to help folks who can't otherwise pay for it get that electrical upgrade as well. But generally speaking, it's not something that the state has been funding on its own. We're seeing bits and pieces where that may change, but usually the state funding is focused on the shiny objects. So I definitely think that's a significant area. And again, that could be something where Marin County could put together some funding, but say this is only for people who can't afford to do it on their own. And there's some great workforce development opportunities to help, work with local mom and pop electrical contractors in those same communities to do the work. You don't have to know anything about whiz bang new technology, electrical panel upgrades, or something that electricians have been doing for a long time. So really glad you raised that up. It's a significant issue. And what's great about that is that you can make an investment that unlocks everything else. It unlocks solar, it unlocks EVs, it unlocks full building electrification and all the cool stuff. And so definitely appreciate you bringing it up. And it's definitely something that I think cities and counties, may want to take a look at in terms of how they can use some limited local dollars to unlock not just deeper decarbonization, but unlock state dollars for other things, right? If you put in money for the thing that unlocks the state dollars, that means you're bringing in additive leverage from other funding resources. So definitely appreciate you bringing it up. It's a significant issue. And going back to, the 110 piece, I think at the same point in time, a lot of people don't realize how far they can get just without a dedicated charger with a home, 110 charger. So I think there's an opportunity in parallel to that to continue to make sure that the basic idea that you don't need a special charger to do at least some baseline charging, that's just not broadly known. And it's particularly not broadly known in the communities that have low levels of early adopter activity. Thanks for the great question and also for the comment. I'll check out that resource. I see a couple of comments in the questions in the chat box, and I see a couple of hands. So maybe Jody and then Susanna.
Yeah, I had a question. I had a comment actually, and I'm just about the panel. So I'm glad you called on me just to mention that, I'm kind of surprised in a way that maybe the state and local government, but they're not tracking on unsafe electrical panels given fire issues. Because, my house was built in 1924. I've lived here 30 years. It was 25 years before I realized I had a Zinsco panel, which is highly associated with electrical shortages, et cetera. And that should have been replaced. It's a fire hazard. So, when I electrified my house, I did all that. But it would seem, especially some low income folks who may have low middle, who have homes, may not, well, I think a lot of people aren't aware of the danger of some of the panels that we do have. And if there could be a program, especially for folks with limited income, to be able to swap some of those out, again, it's one of those keys to the base of building a better system to support everything we're all pushing for. So I was just curious if you had heard about that, or if there's any initiatives. And for those of us who work on fire preparedness and safety, et cetera, I think it's another angle into these, the issue of the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have, because of the work we do specifically in low-income communities, we do a lot of panel upgrades. I've definitely heard, I'm not a technical person myself, but from the teams that do work about those panels in particular being a problem, both in terms of the problem, but also in terms of, and it's not a trivial thing to replace that with a modern one. It requires more time, expertise, but also financial resources. So definitely heard that. And I think, just bouncing around here, I've seen, there's a question here about this advocacy help. And I think part of the challenge here is that most of the advocacy is about the shiny objects, right? And so I think making sure, whether it's advocating at the state level or when you have more control and things at the local level or at the CCA level, to say like, hey, let's not only not forget the more pedestrian aspects of this, like electrical upgrades, but maybe think about that as being a particularly unique place when you do have a little bit more control, to be able to say like, well, let's make sure that, okay, the state's going to fund the shiny objects so that, the governor can do a press announcement and say, we're switching everybody to EVs. That's probably going to get more attention in the media than we're doing something about electrical panels, right? So then how can folks like you all that are trying to take the next level deeper, help identify opportunities to kind of, fill in those gaps with funding or advocacy. But yeah, no, appreciate, it's a really key piece. And again, it's key for solar, key for EVs, key for, this future where we try to electrify, clean up electricity and electrify everything, right? The panel is going to be in some ways the gatekeeper for all of that. I think Susanna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your great presentation. So I just wanted to ask you, I'm on the San Anselmo Climate Action Commission, and we recently had to put together an application for TAM, who's, going to be getting money from the state. And we were trying to figure out, how do we get this to apartment buildings, like what you talked about? It's expensive for the panel upgrades. They, don't have the time, they don't have the money. So we were trying to come up with some solutions, and what we thought about was putting it near apartment buildings. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, like, one of the things we thought about was, I guess they did put in the application was asking for EV arcs from the beam company. So instead of having to trench and put in the electricity, I mean, they're not cheap, but it's a solution. And then the other thing we thought about, which you already talked about, was the orange box for the trickle charge. And then also I wanted to ask you what you thought about light poles, how realistic that is as a solution. Like, my son lives in LA, he's in an apartment building, and there's nowhere really for him to charge cheaply. But if there was, the ability to connect to the light poles for electricity, that would make it easy for that to scale. And then my other question is, with the DC fast chargers, that would, be an option for apartment dwellers. It's expensive. So I don't know if you've come across any way to have like, let's say someone has the care program for their electricity. How possible would it be for that to follow them to the DC fast chargers so they're not paying the high charges? So I know that's a lot, but we're just trying to come up with solutions, and it's hard.
Yeah, well, the last one I'm really particularly going to clue in on, and I may ask you to repeat some of the previous questions so I get to all of them, but this question of how do you provide subsidized access for income qualified folks for public charging is something we're spending a lot of time on. I think it's a huge opportunity. So I'm really glad you mentioned it. We've been doing a pilot of that for the last couple of years in conjunction with the Air Resources Board and EVgo. But the basic premise, and again, we have, folks from the community utility here as well, is that, we've been providing differentiated pricing for electricity for low income folks, since the beginning of utilities, right? The question then becomes, well, how do you do that at a different point of sale besides where they live, right? If you are a low income homeowner and you are already on a discounted rate schedule, you get subsidized EV charging. Right? You plug it in your house, the charger's on your home meter, and the home meter is subscribed to a care program or a low income program. Again, renters can't do that, right? Because, unless you want to run an extension cord illegally into the kitchen through the window. But there isn't really a way for those discounts currently to follow people. So we're working on different solutions, and it's a big coordination problem, right? And you have the EVSPs, the charging companies are the ones that do the billing. You have the utilities, let alone the utilities, plus the community choice aggregators. You have the fact that there's so many different charging networks, and they all work differently, and they don't talk with each other. So it is definitely the long game in terms of doing it in a way that is seamless and really meets the needs for people, like the dream of sort of the EBT card for food stamps, or the Medicare discount card for prescriptions. Ideally, you have an equally simple solution for public charging for folks who need discounted pricing. But we've been working on that. We have a current pilot. We have about 2,000 folks participating into it. We actually are going to be doing a kind of a focus group meeting out at Richmond City Hall, the EVgo chargers that are in front of the library there next Friday, where we're going to be bringing some of our current participants in, talking to them about their experience, how we can improve the offering and what have you. So, it's like any product. Version 1 of any product is usually not very good, but you can't get to the good stuff at version 3, 4, and 5 without going through version 1 and 2 first. But it does need to get solved. How do you provide differentiated pricing for EV charging for low income folks? And if we can, it's an amazing opportunity, right? Because, we do a lot of work with solar to help people lower their electric bills, but there are lots of ways to help people lower their electric bills. Utilities have been doing this for a long time. There is nothing for gasoline. I've never seen any program at any level that provides differentiated pricing for gasoline for people who are struggling. And then you think about today with $6 and $7 a gallon gas. Many of us are lucky enough to be able to drive by that gas station and be like, oh, geez, but not think about, wow, what bill am I not going to pay this month in order to get to work? What things are my family going to have to do without so that I can get my family to school and to medical services and what have you, right? There is nothing. The price at the pump is the price at the pump, whether you're Warren Buffett or whether you're Warren Buffett's secretary or whether you're unemployed. And so to be able to use the switch from gasoline to electricity to finally say, we live in a society that believes that certain things are enough of a right that we shouldn't be charging the same price to everybody, and that folks who are struggling should be able to afford to get from point A to point B. Like, in addition to solving climate, that would be a game changer, right? So we're definitely working on it, but it's in early days and definitely an area that we're going to require a lot of collaboration from different folks. But I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's definitely something we're particularly focused on in addition to the multifamily, piece of things. And I know there was another question earlier, but I don't know if I.
No, it's a lot. I was just wondering if you're working on instead putting chargers near apartment buildings and nearby shopping centers or park and.
Yeah, the grant that I mentioned before that MCE and Grid, Bay Area and the Air District got, will be doing a portfolio of different types of charging projects. It'll be a combination of smart level 1 charging on site, level 2 charging on site, and a couple of housing adjacent fast chargers. And so the whole point is to do a portfolio and then to be able to step back, not just complete all those projects, but look at the portfolio and see what we've learned about it, so that you can really then take those learnings and apply it across the board. Because ultimately, every single apartment complex, whether it's in Marin or in this country, we need to figure out a solution for, right? This is not like a 5, 10, 15% thing. Every apartment complex needs to figure out how to be a gas station. So hopefully having a portfolio of projects that still are all properly resourced on an individual basis, then we can step back at the end. What have we learned and how can we use that to bring this work to scale across the region?
Right, because the other thing is like, and I think what would be great is to work with these fast charging companies instead of giving free charging to people who are buying, $50,000 to $100,000 cars, to provide it for low income. And the other,
we're definitely working on that. Sorry to cut you off. I just know we're getting close.
No, it's
to time.
okay.
There's a couple of questions in the chat box, and want to make sure we get to those before we wrap. Looking at Bernard's question in terms of, I think one of the things that is particularly challenging is that, when you put in charging in, for example, a multifamily housing complex, how much it gets used and how much demand that puts on the building and the grid in year 1 versus year 10 is going to be dramatically different. How do you plan for that? And I think it's a good question. I don't know if we have all the answers, but one of the tools that I think is a really valuable part of that toolkit is energy storage, right? And I think the idea of combining not just charging and solar, but also energy storage, both as a resiliency resource, like, hey, when the grid goes down, does that mean there's no gas at the gas station? But also as a way of buffering the grid from some of the variabilities, whether it's year to year or just hour to hour, right? And so I do think that to the extent that, there are also funding sources for energy storage and opportunities to do things together. The EV ARC product that was mentioned earlier is actually a standalone product that incorporates solar panels, storage, and charging, and doesn't connect to anything. It goes on the back of a truck, and you can just drop it anywhere. And if in a year you're like, hey, it's in the wrong spot, you can move it. That's got its own limitations, cost being the biggest one that was mentioned earlier, but it speaks to that sort of like great, 3-pronged attack if you can really be thoughtful about integration of solar, storage, and charging. So Bernard, thanks for that question. And then Belle, if I pronounce that right, back to the chicken and egg, which in your experience becomes more flexible, opens up first? I think it's all over the map, but I do think going back to how do you get demand for EVs? How do you deal with the chicken and egg issue? So much of this has to do with early adopters, right? And again, in big parts of Marin, you're in kind of early adopter heaven, right? And so part of this is, do people see folks in their neighborhood, people who look like them, people who maybe have the same, linguistic, cultural, racial background, go to the same church, synagogue, mosque, people who they think of as somebody like them adopting it, right? And those early adopters have been critical with every technology. We see the same thing with the low-income solar programs we've run, where the biggest way to get people excited about solar is if there's one early adopter family on the block, in 18 months, there's 7, right? And they don't want to hear about it from folks like us. They want to hear about it from their neighbors who look like them, who they have trust relationships with, who can say this is not a scam, right? And they can kind of like look over, particularly with cars, where it's not just tied into the energy and the logistics of transportation, but also identity. It's very tied into cultures. So I think making sure that, as much as it's great to have highly concentrated groups of early adopters, right? The downside is that that peer effect is less when all the Tesla owners live in the same neighborhood. And so figuring out how to help seed early adopters in the communities that they're not already there, you're not already seeing it on the block, in the church parking lot on Sunday or what have you, that peer effect can be incredibly powerful. And Sebastian, was there a question there? I realized I had sort of thought that maybe, because there was another question from MCE. So sorry about that, Sebastian. Please jump in.
No worries at all, Zach. Yeah, just a couple of comments here. I think to your point, and first of all, this has been a great conversation. I think that third-party validation piece within disadvantaged and undeserved communities is so important. And I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues at MCE the other day, who works very closely on some of our environmental justice and community equity type issues. And I think that there needs to be a sense within the community that, to your point, there are people within my peer network that are adopting these technologies. And my colleague was saying too, that oftentimes when EV charging comes into a new neighborhood, folks have concerns about what the implications of that are with regard to whether it's gentrification or just like new technologies that are not necessarily made for me as folks within that community would feel. So as much as we can do community outreach and demonstrations, I think that that's super important for reaching undeserved populations and folks that have not typically been some of the early EV adopters. I did also want to comment on some of the beam technologies pieces that Susanna brought up a little bit earlier in San Anselmo. To your point, Susanna, they are very expensive. So they typically only make sense in places where distribution level upgrades are even more expensive. So if there's not available capacity, they could be a great resource for that. Another issue with them, and again, they're great in some instances, but they aren't grid tied. And while being off the grid sounds resilient, there is risk for charging power and uptime when relying on solar, right? So if someone's charging during the day, the batteries aren't typically storing enough power for charging outside of that 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. window, which is problematic for a couple different reasons. And then one last comment, my colleague Yana touched on our MCE Sync program, which is an app that we developed to let folks know when the most optimum times to charge their EV are at home, both from a pricing standpoint and when the energy is cleanest. So yeah, Zach just dropped that in the link there. Yana mentioned it was a pilot previously. It's live at this point, and I think you all can expect to see some more heavy marketing and communications associated with that in the following weeks. I know that there's a press release being issued next week too. So that's all I had to say. Awesome presentation, Zach. Thank you for answering all these questions and allowing me to chime in here.
Well, I know we're at time, but I also want to thank you and Yana and the rest of the folks at Marine Clean Energy. Just Marine Clean Energy has really been just a fantastic collaborative partner going back, a long time, and not just specifically on clean energy, but I'll just kind of plug them and obviously plug you all in the community that have helped, create Marin Clean Energy and continue to, to kind of take that kind of community driven electrical kind of vision to the next level. Just been a tremendous collaboration, not just in terms of partnership, but also in terms of helping us find additional funding, right? It was the leadership of one of the folks we work with at Marine Clean Energy that found this opportunity to bring in additional funding with the Marin Community Foundation, to make sure that this work is not just in Oakland and Richmond, but also extends out to Marin as well. That kind of initiative, of saying, hey, let's go out and fill in the gaps, not just do what we can afford to do, but then find other people that can give us the additional funding to do it right. You don't often see that in, electric utilities of different types. And so hats off to the MCE folks for their leadership on this piece in particular.
Zach, do you have a couple more minutes, or do you have to disappear at 10 o'clock?
I have a couple more minutes.
Yeah. I have a more general question, which is, you talked a couple of times about the bright, shiny objects getting funding. That's where the money goes. Do you have some suggestions for how the state might set up a pot of money so that it only goes to the objects that are not bright and shiny, but maybe much more impactful?
Yeah, I think what's happening right now at the state level, but also with some utilities, is that there's at least programs for some of the shiny objects where they're adding in additional funding for the electrical upgrades there. So, yes, you might want to, and I have seen Southern California Edison did propose, it's still waiting on final approval from the Public Utilities Commission. I think it's a $50 million pilot purely for home electrical upgrades with a focus on, income qualified households and historically, impacted census tracts. So, I think it's the state could do it, but utilities can do it. Other folks can do it. But what we're also seeing is just folks who are making sure that if you are funding the shiny object, you put in additive dollars for that. So I'll give an example. Like we've run the low income solar program for the Public Utilities Commission in California since 2008. We've had to deal with a lot of upgrades just to be able to do that program, but there hasn't been dedicated funding for it. And so in the early days, the incentives were high enough that we could basically incorporate that into a project cost. But as the incentives, as they should, go down over time, we've basically had to find either outside funding for that or tell those folks, I'm sorry, we have to prioritize other households because we don't have the financial resources to do both of that. So I think, for future programs, I know there's a big building electrification program that is being finalized as part of the current budget negotiations that again will focus on things like heat pump water heaters. I believe that will also have some amount of funding dedicated for electrical upgrades. So I do think that, yes, standalone funding for electrical upgrades wherever you can get it, I think could be valuable. And I do think, I don't know if that's something that, would happen at the state level versus utilities or CCAs, but I think at a minimum, making sure that the programs that are funding clean energy technologies, solar, EVs, heat pump water heaters, they at least have a line item in there. And then if you can pair that with really comprehensive outreach so that people are not being hit up for each of these programs separately, then you can bring all those things together so that the money for a main panel upgrade can not only unlock one piece, but maybe you can unlock a whole house retrofit.
Mm-hmm. And you've been dealing with MCE clean energy, and you mentioned others, CCAs. Have you been dealing with any jurisdictions, any towns, cities, counties that have been particularly exemplary in their approaches to facilitating clean mobility solutions for underserved populations?
Sorry, say that one more time. I apologize. Just want to make sure I get the question right.
Yeah, sure. So are there any jurisdictions that you've been in touch with that have been exemplary in what they've been doing to facilitate clean mobility solutions? You mentioned the city of Richmond.
City of Richmond was the first one that was going to come to mind. They're not the only one, but I know they're nearby, and there's a deep, long-standing connection both in general with Marin and obviously with Marin Clean Energy being a point of overlap. So, City of Richmond has been able to leverage some of the sort of negotiated funding from when Chevron expanded the refinery, and as part of that negotiation to be able to have its own funding stream to fill in some of these gaps. And then they've been really smart about how they're doing it, right? Again, going back to like all the barriers that you don't think about. It's like, you know, going back to like solar in particular, one of the challenges we have with solar is, in terms of the boring stuff, is really crappy roof conditions for a lot of people. And these days, I don't know if any of you had a re-roofing done lately. The cost of getting a new roof is really expensive for any of us, let alone folks who are living paycheck to paycheck, right? And so getting involved in everything, all the sort of, and again, the city has a broader interest in helping everybody in their community have a good roof, right? Not just about, you know, clean energy. So it makes sense that they would be like plugging in to just improve the overall housing stock of the community for the folks in their community, you know, who are maybe also most at risk of displacement if they can't maintain their home because of financial challenges and just keeping up with the cost of the Bay Area. But also in terms of mobility, they've been doing some really cool community scale stuff. And so they got grant funding from the Clean Mobility Options program that I mentioned earlier. And they created a shuttle program that actually just launched called Richmond Moves. I'll put a link to the chat box. It just came up and running, where it's a state-funded program to help folks, you know, whether get to and from the BART station or what have you. It's you know, students and seniors ride for free, flat fee, $2 per ride for everybody else, you know, all this cool stuff. You know, they just launched a public e-bike share program. And so, yeah, no, I think Richmond is really doing some cutting edge stuff. And to the extent you already have connections, relationships there, and let alone people who commute back and forth between Marin and Richmond for work or other services, you know, I think, you know, there could be some really great opportunities to learn from what they're doing.
Great. Well, I think we're at our hour end. I think folks have really appreciated, Zach, your frank appraisal of what's needed, and your insights have been really helpful. I know on the part of Marin Conservation League, we'll do what we can to amplify some of the themes that you've been raising. Because I think a lot more people need to have a better understanding about this issue. So, is there anything you want to end with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, yeah, thank you for your time and thoughtful questions and what have you. I'll put my email address in the chat box. You know, again, we have a Bay Area team that does all the local work. So in terms of like getting involved in this work in your local community, if there is something that you're involved in, a local government, county government, or what have you, particularly if you're in a place where you're like, you know what, I think maybe we have an opportunity or a funding source to fill in a gap, right? You know, nobody can do it all, but we can do it all if we work together. So if folks have thoughts or about like, hey, when you're working on this multifamily stuff, I have some maybe suggestions in terms of, you know, connections with affordable housing owners, particularly in Marin, where we know that you know it's a little bit more limited, you know, kind of menu at the restaurant there, or other ways to plug in. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm most likely just going to connect you to a colleague, but I can at least be that kind of hub and point. But I think, yeah, the main takeaway is, you know, I think thinking strategically about where you can not only use your voice, but in a local community, you know, use, you know, local funds and what have you, but knowing that given that those local funds are constrained, to do that in a strategic way in conjunction with state and other funding, which is basically what the partnership with MCE has been doing. It's piecing the funding together from many different funding sources where everybody plays a part. If you feel like you have access to some funding, we can kind of work together to, you know, turn that piece into the comprehensive solutions that we're talking about. So feel free to reach out. Really appreciate the time, and have a good weekend.
Thanks so much. Okay, so that was a fire hose of information. Shall we do we want any additional discussion about this now, or should we move to building electrification ordinance? I'm open to suggestions.
Ordinance.
Then hearing no other voices, let's move on. And that's what's needed for Marin's building electrification ordinance. That's you and Belle and Bill.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. That was a great presentation. I wanted to talk some about a letter that's being developed by MCL on building electrification. And we're hoping to get it out in the next couple of days in the context of a couple of, of large things that we've been talking about for a while that are happening in the county. You may, most of you, be aware that the county's been working on a multi-jurisdictional ordinance, or an ordinance that could be adopted by all 12 jurisdictions in the county on building electrification as a means of sort of easing things by having a uniform approach in the various jurisdictions. And that's been going on for quite a while. They're scheduled to roll it out at a public workshop meeting next Wednesday, I believe it is the 22nd. Did I get that right? Yeah, June 22nd. And there's information on the county website about that. I would encourage those interested in showing up and looking under the hood of what's being proposed and seeing if we can't make it as strong as possible. At the same time, just last Monday, I believe it was, the Marin grand jury issued a really interesting and comprehensive report on building electrification. And so the time is ripe, really, to weigh in and again, try to encourage the county as it takes this major step forward to make that step as strong as possible. The other bit of context, which you're probably most of you are probably aware of, is that energy use in houses and in other buildings, so it's both residential and commercial properties, represent about a third of the greenhouse gas footprint as it's measured in the county. So it's a big deal. And it is also an area which is traditionally under the purview of local government, with, I must say, a lot of guidance and incentives from the state level as well. But locality, it comes down to localities, and if localities want to be proactive about this and have the support from us to do that, they can get a lot done in the reduction of greenhouse gases. And the other context, I think, to set is that it takes time. Whatever ordinance is rolled forward now, if we're getting to goals that are out in the 2030 or 2045 range, which we are for greenhouse gas reduction, it's going to take a decade or so for that ordinance to slowly be ramped up as new houses are built, as houses are rehabbed, et cetera. So anyway, that's sort of the introduction. I've got to say that this letter that I'll try to succinctly review with you and get your input on was largely the work of Ken Strong with a bunch of other input from others on the energy subgroup of COG. So Bob and Pam were involved in that. Jim Burrows was here earlier, Tom Flynn, Peter Swartz, and I may be missing, there's several other people who had input into this thinking. So basically, the letter lays out the importance of electrification, ties it not only to climate, but also to reducing public health and safety risks within the house, the sort of thing that Jody was referring to earlier, as well as air quality inside. It also talks about the exposure that we have to rising fossil fuel costs, or that consumers have to rising fossil fuel prices, and avoiding stranded assets in putting in technologies that are going to be outdated sooner than their lifespan in some cases. So after that introduction, it gets into, well, what can Marin do about it? And basically this divides into three sections, and it's really the last of those that that is probably where MCL is bringing some maybe new or some additional thoughts to the table. So those three areas are, well, all new buildings should be electric. Okay, that seems to be a fairly widely accepted notion. And from what we've heard about the ordinance so far, will be incorporated into this ordinance that's under consideration. Secondly, to enact also a county ordinance or build on the state concept of a reach code, a building code that reaches beyond what the state actually requires in dealing with building renovations. So the renovations would be, in the approach to this, it's being looked at, and that this letter more or less endorses, is that there would be a menu of things you can do when you're rehabbing to make your building more energy efficient. And that menu would be weighted fairly strongly to encouraging that among those things you do would be electrification steps, like heat pump water heaters and heat pump HVAC systems being the big ones. So that's the approach there. The language in the letter tries to get out a little in front of that and say, the ordinance would encourage a shift in the manner that I just said, but may also consider requiring that shift, at least over time. That's not, I think, currently on the table. So that if you did a rehab, it would require that that electrification take place. The third area, which the climate, the new grand jury report, calls a countywide building electrification plan with a fairly tight timeline of, I think they say January 24, our letter says July 2023, to accelerate electrification of all other buildings, right? So even if new buildings and rehabs are under an ordinance, that's not going to address the major transition of existing appliances and systems to off of natural gas and onto electrical. So that's the third area that the letter addresses and really tries to push forward a little more proactively than what we've heard about so far. So the idea is that the plan would be in place, but it would encompass a number of particular steps towards requiring electrification of, throughout the building infrastructure. So that would start with education, programs that really get people up to speed on the benefits and cost savings operationally of electrical appliances, and up to speed on what rebates and incentives are available, what kind of assistance is available. And very importantly, that people start, that would educate folks about the importance of life cycle planning in thinking about thinking about dealing with these systems. How long is it going to last? When am I going to need to replace it? Even more importantly, when is what I already have going to break down and need replacement? So I can begin to plan towards that, figure out what to do, replace it hopefully before it's 40 degrees outside on a January day, and I'm running out to find out whatever I can find to get warm again. So that would be part of the educational thing that we're encouraging. Also, and then beyond that, to really look at time of sale as being a critical part in the decision-making process of transforming a building stock, and not to require electrification at that point, although we may eventually get there, but that we require that the building inspections that are a part of any property transfer include identification of the useful life of the gas appliances that are in that building, and flag out to people what sort of upgrades are necessary to support, to transform that into electrical, and to flag that that transition is going to be required at some point, and when will that be? So one of the, well, I won't go into further detail. We can save that for discussion if you want. But at least it would get the ball rolling at that point. It then would tie into a stronger recommendation, which would be that be a requirement that gas heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC, and water heaters and other appliances to replace gas with electric within 5 years of a building's purchase. So it's setting out a time frame for taking the money, that is involved in a property transaction, and understanding that some of that's going to need to be applied forward to that transition. And then setting a goal that parallels the state's goal for EVs, which is not selling any EVs after 2035, building that into building electrification, saying, after that point, in Marin, you wouldn't be able to install a gas system, a fossil fuel system in a building. So we're trying to set a fairly aggressive timeline and set of and ways of getting there for the most important or the largest part of the problem that we're dealing with. They're also tied to that would be encouragement of the kinds of incentives that we've been talking about for the last hour, rebates, also financing, PACE financing and other things that are available to people for addressing the upfront cost of the transition, and that we're requesting that the county, in its consideration, and others like MCE, really look at those incentives and beef them up as much as possible, hopefully closing the gap, with the goal of closing the gap between the cost of just replacing something with another gas appliance versus the cost of electrification, including panel upgrades, which is part of what we cover. And then also augmenting those to really urge the continued look for state, federal, other sources that would augment the local sources to provide that kind of those kinds of cost incentives. And then finally, we've asked that this plan a year from now include an emphasis on how do we address electrification in multifamily dwelling units and in lower income areas and households. So that's a gist of the letter. We're trying to finalize it, as I say, in the next couple of days in order to get it into the mix prior to this meeting next Wednesday. So, open for business in terms of comments here today and emails to Bob or me over the next, let's say, 24 hours. So we can, get this done over the weekend and be ready to roll early next week. So I'm done with that. Happy to hear questions or comments or ideas.
So Sebastian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thanks for all the thoughtfulness going into the letter, Bill. I just wanted to make a quick plug. I know you all had heard from Corey Bidoff and Brian Reyes on some of the model reach code ordinance development that's been taking place at a county and city level. Next Wednesday, if you haven't seen, there's actually a workshop taking place, and I can drop it in the chat here, that's open to the public. And what we're trying to get at with this workshop, what the county is trying to get at, is demonstrating all of the players at a state and a local level that need to coordinate to make these types of electrification goals happen in the future. So with the panel, there's a representative from the California Independent System Operator. We have a representative from PG&E, with the California Energy Commission, and with the city of Petaluma as well, which I think is our closest neighboring city, not in Marin, obviously, but one that has recently passed building electrification ordinances. And yeah, it'll be interesting to hear all of their perspectives, right? Because when we're talking about building electrification, we need to also focus on how is the state managing that supply and demand as we begin to electrify at scale. How is PG&E planning for doing their capacity planning, right? And whether it's substation upgrades, whether it's distribution circuits that need to be upgraded, what all that looks like. So I think it'll be a good chance for you all to ask some questions at Content Matter experts, and I'd encourage you to tune in next Wednesday.
Thanks, Sebastian, for that. Very helpful. That's the meeting I was alluding to earlier. So now you know exactly where it is.
Okay, so is there further discussion? Anybody want to raise any additional? Lori.
Hi, everybody. Bill, and to Ken and Bob and others, sounds like we got a very thorough letter almost to the end. I really like the idea of setting a future date after which no new gas appliances for heating and for HVAC and water heating can be sold. I like the electric vehicle number. Have you gotten a year in mind, or are you just throwing out the concept?
No, we tied it directly to the same as the EV, so 2035. Yeah.
I think that's great. I just think these aspirational goals do a lot more. They have some real world effect, but I think they change the debate. So I strongly endorse that approach. 2035.
Thanks.
Yeah, I do think that the grand jury report idea of having a countywide plan is important because it means that it would be possible to get all of the stakeholders together to figure out what needs to be done. And with that kind of plan in mind, and especially with a focus on underserved populations, it then becomes possible to get to make grant applications to get larger projects, ones that can scale, and hopefully if they're innovative projects, ones that can be proven and then disseminated elsewhere. So Marin could be of use to other areas in California and beyond. And I think that in effect, what we need is this building electrification plan and a vehicle electrification plan in parallel. And they should be talking to each other. So it's going to be many of the same groups of folks, and there really is no way to get money to scale a project and to do something innovative without having a thorough plan available. So let's do our work with that in mind. And Wendy, you have your hand up?
There we go. Needed to unmute. Sorry. Yeah, this is in relation to that and working together. It's kind of a straddling of this issue and just doing our reports from our organization. Obviously, there's a lot of work going into developing this ordinance, and I'm really glad that this is happening. Sustainable Marin is very interested in how do we take these ordinances and make sure that they are implemented in every town in Marin. And with that in mind, we're working on creating a rapid response action network. And the idea is to have teams of people in every town set up to respond to these kind of policy initiatives, so that when something is, once the county passes the ordinance, then every town is prepared with people on the ground who are ready to meet with representatives, write letters, and show up at meetings so that we can get these ordinances passed. This is something that we're in the development stage, and I would love to be able to get on a future agenda so that we can have a discussion on how all our organizations can partner with developing this action network. So I don't want to take up a lot of time now, but I would like to be able to get on a future agenda so we can have a more broad discussion about this.
If I can insert one response into that, also agree completely that, each jurisdiction, we've got to get people out to the microphone when this comes up, because the default of jurisdictions tends to be business as usual. And that's not the situation we're in right now. We've got to stress that, this is something they can do and they can do it now. And along those lines, the grand jury, of course, the process there is that every jurisdiction has to respond to that grand jury report within a certain amount of time, meaning the next couple of months. So there's an opportunity there. And if we don't jump on that and get people in front of microphones and letters in front of, council members, then we will have lost a real opportunity. So
just to be clear, this action network doesn't exist right now.
Right.
And that's why we want to set up the process where we can develop. It's basically going to be a database of people that, with a captain and the people on their teams for each town. And as we build with this particular ordinance, you're going to be gathering people for it. There's the foodware ordinance that's also being talked about in the county. So that there's two initiatives already going on, and if we can use those instead of implementing them and then letting those people go drift back in the woodwork, we want to be able to keep them on board by having them join this network. And as I said, we can talk in more detail about it at a future meeting.
Great. Pam, and then Jody.
I just have a quick one. And that's that we haven't said it out loud in the meeting, but it is in our letter that we're including gas stoves cooking, because the criticalness of health, how those impact health, and want to get them out of people's kitchens. So it's not just the things that already have rebates, like water heaters and furnaces. So rest assured that's in the letter as well.
Jody, and then Peter.
Yeah, I guess I want to just mention to Wendy and to all of you, if you're not aware that of the building electrification squad and the EV squad that have both been working, lots of community leaders. There is a list that David Moeller's been putting together of community members in every city. So, there is a lot of work going on a number of layers. And I think for any of you who are interested, particularly in building electrification, you might want to pop into at least one of those meetings and sort of stay connected, because that is a group of all of us from cities and towns and different nonprofits who are working aggressively as much as we can with the county and with cities and towns. And I guess I also just want to make the plug that I love the countywide efforts. And if they don't also parallel right now actions in the cities and towns, we're just dragging our feet, because as we know, countywide initiatives take a lot of time and effort, they're wonderful and they give us access to things that local city and town efforts don't. But, you know, half of us are still sitting around waiting for the EV readiness plan, which is supposed to be a countywide effort that's, you know, coming. And our towns are very different in terms of their willingness sometimes to move aggressively on some of these things. And as you know, Fairfax we have pressured Fairfax and they are moving more quickly. San Anselmo just passed an all electric for new building, their first hearing. So if we're not doing these things parallel, the cities and towns have to do it after the county, or, you know, once there's a model ordinance anyway. There's no reason not to, as you're saying, Wendy, identify people in local communities, work together, get that going now, prepping both the community and the staff and the town council of what we're talking about and what's necessary as community leaders. If we don't do them together, we're just, you know, we're being the climate delayers, you know, which is this new term of folks who know all about it, but just aren't pushing fast and hard enough. And it's difficult to find community members who have time and energy for this, but we got to do them together. So I just wanted to throw those points out and encourage people to consider sitting in on the BE and EV squad meetings.
Yeah.
So Jody, I just sent you a chat. Take a look at that.
Thank you, Jody. That, you know, totally good points. And my apologies for not mentioning the building electrification squad. You know, the work they've done has been fundamental to this and very effective in getting us to where we are.
Yeah. And Jody, I'm glad that you mentioned, I'm glad that you gave your interpretation of countywide, because what we're going to have to do is be clear. By countywide, we mean not the county, but the counties and jurisdictions and the Transportation Authority of Marin and MCE Clean Energy and all of the relevant stakeholders working in collaboration with each other, so that you don't wind up with the county coming up with one thing and then everybody chases after the jurisdictions to try to get them in alignment. So I think there's real agreement on that approach. Okay, so Peter and then Susanna.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts popped to mind while we were talking. One of the things you raised was homeowners running into a situation where they have equipment burnout and they're forced into emergency conditions. I'm trying to choose the right equipment. And I think one way to mitigate that is to try and develop a countywide program for a free home checkup. And so you sign up qualified trained contractors who are essentially auditors, who are not necessarily installers, so you don't get self-dealing. And they come out and look for existing equipment and inform the homeowner about the useful life of the equipment they currently have. And there's some we used to do a lot when I was at PG&E with on the commercial side. The other thing that came to mind is there's a bit of a challenge with point of sale rebates. And frequently what you're trying to buy might be out of stock. And we found that a better approach is to do more upstream manufacturing incentives, because what it does is it gets the manufacturers to promote the right or preferred equipment. And it also helps prime the supply chain to make sure stuff stays in stock. The other advantage about that is it makes it easier to partner with the existing programs that the utilities have. And so you get more leverage that way. Also, point of sale is kind of hit or miss. To be really effective, you need people in the aisles talking to consumers, talking about that. And, the little promotional material tends to get shoved to the back if someone isn't there to manage it. And then lastly, I think we need to keep in mind that Title 24, the state energy standards, are diving deep into building electrification. And so state energy code will require that anyone who pulls a permit will have to put in certain type of equipment with regard to electrification. That will help having to go jurisdiction by jurisdiction in Marin to try and get people to adopt ordinances. In advance of the code being adopted, obviously trying to get local ordinances to adopt rich codes is a method to do that.
Sue?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of the things I want to work on is educating contractors. One of my neighbors was gonna replace her furnace, and the contractor told her, well, don't do electric unless you have solar because it's too expensive. And I don't really get that because I know natural gas spikes and is so expensive. So I don't know where they're coming up with that. But I know that's a big thing, which probably everybody here knows. But the other thing that I've run up against or learned about is that staff, the planning directors, don't want to have to deal with remodels because they have to, sort of manage these contractors or builders or developers who will come around and just do a bunch of different permits to avoid the major remodel. So I just know it's a problem with staff time that we want to, we just passed the building electrification ordinance for new homes, but we want to work on major remodels, but the staff time is a problem just because they're so overworked. And anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it's 10:40 and we have another important topic to raise. So what I was going to suggest is that we move on to the California Air Resources Board scoping plan for combating climate change.
Before you do that, don't we need to close the deal and say, this is the letter we're going to write. So if you have any input, do it like what Bill said, just wrap that up and say, we are putting a letter out that will, so I don't know if anybody wants to be able to read it before they, so I just think that piece needs to be wrapped up.
Sure. So what's going to happen is that a group of us are going to finalize a letter, and what we're going to do internally within Marine Conservation League is, so we can finalize a letter. What we could do if you is vote on the outline of the letter that that Bill mentioned, and find out if there are any objections to sending a letter with that content or not. But I think what we then will wind up doing is having a discussion within Marine Conservation League, because what we like to do is to send it from Marine Conservation League to supervisors and to others. And there's a Marine Conservation League board meeting on Tuesday, and where we could have a discussion of that and a vote, and then get it out, and then it would be at least sent prior to the kickoff workshop meeting on the 22nd. So if I've been reluctant to ask folks to vote on anything that they haven't seen beforehand, and we've not had the ability to have a letter. But if we want to vote on the gist of what Bill talked about, that this is something that the Climate Action Working Group recommends to the Board of Marine Conservation League, then let's do it. Yeah, Lori.
Should we just ask people to raise their thumb if they think they want to endorse the content as described very thoroughly by Bill?
I think that that's great. So we could also do it we could do it that way. We could proceed. All those in favor, raise your hand.
Oop, got the hand in the screen.
All right, and I got a thumbs up from Julia. And are there any that are opposed? And there was another thumbs up from Wendy, but that was for yes. Are there any abstaining? Okay, so this will be a recommendation from the Climate Action Working Group to the board, Marine Conservation League board, to send this letter to the supervisors. And thank you, Pam, for closing the deal. Appreciate that. Okay, so let's move on to a discussion about the California Air Resources Board scoping plan and a potential letter from Marine Conservation League on that. So Bill.
Yeah, I'm ready to talk about it.
Okay.
First of all, I just want to ask a question. How many of you have seen or know about the CARB 2022 scoping plan? Raise your hand if you have some familiarity with it. Okay, that's good. It's over 200 pages and it's comprehensive. And and we got to it a little late, but I'll just give one little background here, which is that first of all, the scoping plan updates, assesses progress toward the statutory 2030 target, and it lays out a path to achieving carbon neutrality no later than 2045. And in 2000, it began in 2006 with AB 32. It mandated achieving a reduction then, and it created a cap and trade program and required CARB to require a scoping plan to meet the emission target. And so the portfolio is broken down between regulatory, 75 regulatory, and then the rest from a cap and trade program. Just thought I'd throw that out as a beginning to, so we've looked at this, and this is the 5th scoping plan, and it's very ambitious and comprehensive, but it has raised a lot of concerns in the environmental and scientific community, and there have been comments. There's a due date for comments back to CARB for this plan, and that is next week, the 24th of June. And there is a meeting where this will be discussed on the 23rd, and we can provide you with that information. It's really quite important because it does lay out policy for the state over the next 5 years. So for that reason, we are thinking of producing a letter from CARB, from us. Sorry. A letter from MCL to CARB, which lays out some fundamental issues that we have, and we would like them to address. So let me just mention sort of what these are. First of all, we give some credit to them because it moves to a framework of carbon neutrality. So the scope for accounting is expanded to include all greenhouse gases, sources, and sinks. As such, carbon neutrality is achieved when the flux of greenhouse gases from the sources equal the sinks. And this is what they say: we have a chance to re-envision California's future and set the stage on a path to be carbon-free by 2045 while advancing equity. And the scoping plan provides a roadmap outlining key policies we can implement to achieve our climate goals while improving the health and welfare of Californians and addressing disparities in health ordinances to create a more equitable future. Within that context, we would like to point out that we have some critical, to achieve these critical outcomes, we at MCL would like to provide would like to suggest that they do a more thorough, robust analysis on a range of issues. And I'll just read you the topics. And by the way, this letter would be quite broad-based and would not get into the detail that it deserves. First is describing more fully how the state can achieve its 40% greenhouse gas 2030 GHG emission reduction goals. It's the first one. Modeling and how to reach the 2045 carbon neutral goal with higher emissions. Accelerating to 2035 a carbon neutral goal necessary given the urgency of the climate crisis. Modeling on how to reach 100% clean electric grid, elevating the role of natural and working lands to carbon sequestration, and detailing what is necessary to improve the cap and trade program to that it's capable of achieving the reductions of CARB expects from it. So we have more details on that, on each one of these, but the question is, do you feel comfortable? First of all, do you think it's important enough for MCL to comment on this very substantial, comprehensive state policy, which I say has received a lot of criticism for not being fast enough to achieve the real goals of the state and what Governor Newsom is calling for. And also, there's also a letter that went out from 73 organizations. I thought it was pretty impressive. 73 organizations on this subject, mostly dealing with fossil fuel reduction. And it's something to see. But we feel that it is possible to raise the points that I just mentioned with the kind of work that we've done so far. And I'd say that Ken and Bill and Bob and I have looked at this with some degree of care. So my question to you is, do you think we should our view is that we should be at the table on this. We don't have to have all the answers, but we want to be part of the process that's taking place between now and December to get this re-reviewed. And so if we send them a document, a statement like what we're talking about, we would be considered. We also are saying that sometime in the fall, we're thinking of having a forum on the subject of the scoping plan, and we'd like them to participate, but that's a side point. So where do people stand on this? Are they comfortable enough with moving ahead with a sort of a bare bones, but nevertheless a well thought out set of objectives to them? Or do you feel that in a way you need more time to think through what is on the table?
And thank you, Belle. What I would do is just add something to the second point that you raised, which is I think unless I heard it incorrectly, I think it was left out a clause. The second point is to model how to reach the 2045 carbon neutral goal with with greater focus on emission reductions
Yeah.
and less focus on unimproved technologies for carbon sequestration.
Yeah,
There's-
that's in,
there's-
I'm sorry, I didn't read it. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, because there's just too much focus on technologies which have yet to be developed to achieve the carbon neutrality. And that's sort of a classic way that folks have been, that the jurisdictions or countries have been appearing to be really green, but not being green enough. Pam?
I don't think there's enough time to get that letter out. I think it might be better to sign on to the, did Sierra Club write it, start it? But are there a lot of signatories on it? That it's a really good letter.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you. Belle, why don't we hear from Terry and then respond?
sure.
Terry?
Yeah, I have just been pondering MCL's processes on these, and I was wondering in the latest board guidelines, this particular policy on carbon emissions, it identifies it as a draft. Is this now a final policy? And if it is this letter, covered in that policy? Those are my questions.
Yeah, so the way things work at Marine Conservation League is there's an overarching policy. When we send out a letter, the letter really has to be in sync with the overall policy. And in this case, it's the policy was adopted in June last year by the board, so it's no longer a draft. And so yes, it's in sync with, the letter is in sync with the policy. Lori?
My question is, what is the advantage to MCL sending its own letter as opposed to signing on? I can see some pros in having more letters from different organizations rather than one letter that has, 75 plus signatories on it. But is there any administrative requirement that we get special notifications of future proceedings by sending a letter in from MCL? Or are we making different points or emphasizing things differently than in the large letter that the 75 other organizations have signed on to? That's just a need for more information for me.
I thought about this, and I read carefully the 73, there's 73 on that letter. It focuses almost entirely on fossil fuels, and it's good. It has, and we don't, and that part of it we respect. They don't deal with the other issues that we're dealing with, and which is the one that, changing the target of 2045 for carbon neutral to 2035, the question of carbon reduction methodology and the mechanical approach. And it also it doesn't deal with something we're concentrating on, which is for the first time they're including natural and lands as one of the sectors for sequestration. And we have good input on that from the Carbon Cycle Institute and also from our own knowledge. So we're bringing up a few areas that are not covered by the other letters. That's one of the reasons we wanted to be at the table, to be able to observe those things. And I think we could actually acknowledge the excellent arguments made in the 73 letter about fossil fuels.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing, let's talk a bit about process, which is that we could talk about this group recommending to the Marine Conservation League Board to send a letter on this topic. The thing I want to emphasize is that for Marine Conservation League to send out a letter, board members have to feel comfortable with the content. And the reality is that the Climate Action Working Group until very recently focused primarily on education and not on advocacy. And what that's meant is that there are a bunch of issues which really haven't been discussed thoroughly at the MCL board level. So there's a certain getting up on a learning curve on the part of some board members. So if this group says, yes, let's send some kind of letter to the California Air Resources Board, what we're going to wind up doing is discussing it at the Marine Conservation League board meeting. If folks don't feel comfortable, then if some folks don't feel comfortable, we won't send the letter, but we will continue the discussion. And I think that over time, things will get easier when there's just more advocacy coming from this group, so more issues are raised and there's more discussion within the entire Marine Conservation League board. For other of the Marine Conservation League committees have been doing advocacy work for decades, in the case of some of them. So there's not the same problem. Kate?
I do want to agree with you in terms of process. I think it's really important that we are very deliberate in what we write, and it's needs to be aligned with positions that we've taken in the past. We've been following carbon sequestration on working land since 2014, when some of the initial experiments were being done out in West Marin, and there's been a lot of change over the years in terms of, not a lot, but there have been some new information and some. So as a board member, I just want to state that I need to be able to read something and look at it, compare it to what our policy is, what other positions we've taken through the Ag Land Use Committee, et cetera, because I think it's very, very important for MCL to be very clear in what we're advocating for and not have any kind of conflict with other committees that are working on projects, and also what positions we've taken in the past, unless we state in that letter what our evolved position is. So I do think that we need something in writing, and we need the backup material provided to us to read it and inform ourselves before we send something.
Yeah, there certainly would be something in writing. What I want to do is apologize to folks because the letter came together pretty late in the process, and that always creates problems. What I will say about this is that this issue is not going to go away. It is true that the California Air Resources Board may be making a final decision, maybe not, on the meeting on the 23rd about its scoping plan. But there's so much just unhappiness on the part of environmentalists with that scoping plan. It is so inadequate in so many very fundamental ways that this is going to be coming up again and again. We're going to have other bites of the apple on this one down the road.
Can I just add one thing, Bob? And that is that my view, I understand all of this, and I'm a new board member, so I listen carefully to what you're saying. But in my view, there's some urgency for MCL to be at the table on this. And they really are urging, and I've been in touch with them, the CARB people, they're really urging us to get something in by next week. It could be pretty much more general than what we're thinking. It could be we've looked at it, and even referring to the other submissions that have been made and making our 3 or 4 points, maybe not well developed, and leave it at that. And the question is whether MCL can do that. And I don't know, maybe this organization isn't ready to do that kind of more broad-based, simple method of getting involved right away at the ground level in this conversation. I mean, we got on it late. Other people did too, but anyway, so that's where I'm coming from, but it's up to the rest of you. Bill, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, kind of following up on that, actually. It seemed that, you know, the letter is like a page and a half. It's very broad, and therefore it, you know, we kind of purposely didn't try to get into the details of a 200-page document to comment on it. We just don't have that bandwidth, probably don't have that expertise. But by being a very broad letter, it at least weighs in on the issues that are kind of most important to us, including natural and ag land, and just what, you know, that it is an important element to be considered. And I think MCL is well positioned to make that sort of comment. So what I would suggest is, you know, the letter is we could circulate it. Bob, you referred to a meeting of the board on Tuesday, I think it was. So there could be that included in that board package, so people could see if they were comfortable with that broad enumeration of issues that we're trying to bring to the table.
I would ask that you also provide a link, Bob, to the 200-page CARB plan, and a link to the letter that their environmental organizations have submitted already.
Yeah. So yes, Pam.
Maybe the letter can be shortened and not, I don't think we need all that stuff in the beginning about
how we agree with them.
No, I don't think and it won't be impolite to leave that out, but just boom, boom, boom.
Okay.
Thank you, Pam. Terry?
I apologize. I have not read the letter. And I'm mainly coming from an issue overlaps committee perspective, which is my job at MCL. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody realized that the carbon policy that has been approved is not the sequestration policy. That's still in the works also. So just be careful about the language about carbon sequestration and make sure that it's still within our emissions policy that Bob was saying is approved. Thanks.
Thank you.
So what I would suggest is that we just vote on the gist of a letter, and which would be that, and so it would be that the Climate Action Working Group recommends to the Marine Conservation League Board to send a letter with these following main points. Have a subcommittee that works on the letter, and then take it to the board. We'll have a time for discussion there, and then see how that goes. But the Climate Act, there we go. Thank you, Lori. Big thumbs up. I think that's the simplest way of doing it. So what I would like to do then is just to ask folks, can we go on to just voting on whether to recommend to the Marine Conservation League Board, whether to recommend to the board that a letter be sent, and that it will go for discussion at the board, and then may or may not go further. Does that sound right? Okay. Good. Okay. So so people did have their hands up. All those in favor of that, raise your hands. All right. Those opposed, those abstaining. Okay. Terry. Okay. Great. All right. So with that, we are 7 minutes over, which I apologize for, but been some good discussions. So we'll see you next month, folks. We'll have speakers on a very different topic, offshore wind, but we're also going to continue the discussion about the building electrification ordinance and countywide plan, and also about accelerating EV adoption. So with that, I guess we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.